what we call empowered communities, which is a collaboration of organisations, Tyrone's in the audience here today, who collaborate without the drive of government. It was designed by people that were just working in different places to take responsibility back, to drive it from our communities, capture data and prove how empowerment works. And I'll say that a few times today. But if I could please get you to make Dean welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Shane. I'm not going to stand behind. I get nervous, funnily enough, standing behind podiums rather than in front of them. Plus, I can't show off the campaign T-shirt. Firstly, obviously, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and bring greetings from my own peoples, as Shane said, the Quandamooka peoples from Indiribah, North Stradbroke Island. Beautiful place in the world. If you haven't been, go. Certainly this time of year, it is absolutely the place to be. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the voice and why it matters, why it's important, not just for us, the 3% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, but why this referendum that's coming in the next few months, where we'll see 18 million Australians go to the polls, vote in the referendum for the first time since 1999, to achieve a successful yes vote on Indigenous constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament. I just want to talk to you about why that is important, what's happening now and what you can expect. And then I'll just stop and open up for questions, because I know that there are questions out there and people are looking for further information, and that's certainly part of what we will do as the campaign. And I also just want to acknowledge Shane. He's the typical person in our communities that will not talk about what he does, and already shuffling his feet sitting over there as I talk about him. He won't talk about what he does, and he won't talk about the way that he does it and the way that others alongside, and I know he doesn't do it by himself, I know there are others alongside him in the community that do this, but this idea of the innovation and the enterprise and the creativity and the wisdom and experience of our community members on the ground in communities across the country. Shane mentioned Tyrone Garstone there from the Kimberley as well. I've just gone through a road trip with Tyrone through that region, listening to community members on the ground. It is there too. Every single of our communities that you go to, you hear this aspiration, you hear this wisdom, you hear these ideas. And these are the people, Shane and his community members and Tyrone and his and mine, are the ones that are here on a day-to-day basis, experiencing both the very good things that are happening that don't get reported on, that don't get talked about a lot, and are also at the cold face of the challenges. And we're seeing the interventions come from capital cities across the country, from different places that don't understand our communities. And it's people like Shane that are working there, and Tyrone and others that are working there on a day-to-day basis, striving for their communities, knowing what works, having seen the things that don't work over and over and over again. Shane talked about resilience. Part of that resilience is just dealing with continual externally applied failed approaches, and knowing that if we just listen, we just give a real voice to our people in communities, that is the foundation to really address some of these issues that are facing our communities. It is why I am doing the work, and it is why our campaign is doing the work that we are doing, because we've been involved in processes working with communities like Shane and Tyrone's and others across the board, and that is how we've ended up 3 months away from a historic referendum. Just want to go back really quickly. I know it's always a fraught business following a speech done by Noel Pearson on the same spot. No comparison, and I don't want to go over the same ground. I know Noel. What I understand, Noel talked as Noel does, very powerfully about the original kind of constitutional omission, and then what happened in '67 and what has happened since, and kind of the constitutional rationale for how we've ended up at this point. You could have had no better speaker to talk about that. What I'll do is pick it up from 2017, from the Uluru Statement, very, very briefly, because there's a couple of things that happened in that process that aren't well known, that are very, very pertinent to why we are here right now and why we are going down the track we're going down. Noel would have talked about recognition and he would have talked about voice. Needless to say, those two things are absolutely linked. The voice is recognition. It is not recognition and a voice. We'd gone through decades of process, decades of parliamentary processes, reports, committees. In fact, Linda Burney, who's now obviously the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, 30 years ago was part of writing a report called Recognition, Rights and Reform. She's been at this for a very, very long time, talking about constitutional recognition. It wasn't until 2016, 2017, that we really sat back and said, well, let's ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, if we are going to recognise you in the Constitution as the first peoples of this country, what is the most meaningful form? There's so many different forms. You can insert a preamble to the Australian Constitution, doesn't exist now. You can insert some other statement of acknowledgement. There are all sorts of means, and across the world, they do it through treaties, they do it through standalone parliaments, they do it through dedicated seats in parliaments. So Australia has been wrestling with this idea. What is the option that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want in such a way that makes sense for the Australian history and the Australian political context? What do we want? What is desirable? What is feasible? What is viable? What can we actually make happen with due regard to our own circumstances? Because we're not New Zealand, we're not Canada, we're not Scandinavia, we've got a different history. So our mob put our minds to the task. I was involved in that process that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I had the great privilege of signing the statement. What our mob came out with was very clear. Recognition cannot be just symbolic. You have to look at our communities and understand what's happening in many of our communities. We always want to come from this from a position of strength and a position of empowerment and positivity, and also acknowledge that there are significant challenges facing our communities. Our mob don't have to read the Closing the Gap reports. They don't have to listen to the Productivity Commission only a couple of weeks ago talk about how only 4 of the 17 Closing the Gap targets are on track to be met. They don't have to talk about the rates of mental health and suicide, the fact that our young people are not achieving the same education, employment and training opportunities as the non-Indigenous population. They are living it on a day-to-day basis. And so when the Uluru Statement came out and said, well, what form of recognition is most suitable, it was no surprise. It was utterly no surprise that our mob said, we've got to have a voice. We've got to have it. We want in. We want in to the decisions about policies and laws that affect our people. We want to be part of it. Leaving it to the politicians, leaving it to the parliamentarians, leaving it to governments, it hasn't worked. We've tried that, and that is despite goodwill. That is despite ongoing investment in Indigenous affairs. It's not through lack of trying, it's through lack of that insight and intelligence and wisdom that only our people in our communities can provide. So we want to be part of it. We want to inform those decisions because we want, fundamentally, better outcomes for our people. We want to see the return on investment from taxpayer spend on what's going on in Indigenous affairs. We're tired of being told how much money gets spent on our people without an ability to influence that. So that is what we want. So that is why recognition is the voice. That is why when our people, I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that is not well known about the Uluru Statement, there was a very strategic decision that happened there. We have seen, and it is the reason why we're doing this referendum now, it is the reason why we are in the thick of the largest campaign our country has ever seen, and it is the reason why 18 million voters are going to go to the polls in a couple of months' time and cast their decision, yes or no, in favour of this question. We've tried the parliamentary route before. We've tried our appeals, sending our appeals to prime ministers, to politicians, to governments. We've created these wonderful statements of ambition and reform, of legal change, of cultural richness, and we've invited prime ministers to sit with us in our communities, and the press packs have arrived, and they've taken the photos and they've garnished the acclaim, and they've taken these statements, whether they're the Larrakia petitions or the Yirrkala Bark petitions or the Barunga statements. They've taken them, made promises, and then after the cameras die down, there's no action on those statements. They're not just beautiful artworks, although they are. They get hung up on the wall in Canberra, and they're there. I unfortunately spent a lot of time walking the halls, and they're there, and you can see them as decorative art pieces, not as the calls for change that they are. That doesn't represent the work that's gone into those and the aspirations that sit there. And so recently, we've just had NAIDOC week, and the theme was for our elders. Well, it was our old people at Uluru that said, we're doing this differently this time. We've tried our appeals to the parliaments. We've tried our appeals to governments. We've got to go to their bosses. We've got to go over their heads, because that doesn't work. We've got to go to the people. We've got to make sure that this is put to the Australian people in a vote of the people to change the constitution through a referendum. Now, they knew that this was going to be tough. They knew. We know the history. We know 8 out of 44 questions have been successful in this country. We know the constitutional route is not the easy route. And some people are finding out that now, that it is not the easy route, but it is the right one. It is the right one if we're to actually make this change, if we are finally to make the change that we want to see. It's not just about the means by which we change the constitution. We need you on board. We need millions of Australians coming out and saying, this is important to me. This is not just a project for the 3% of the population. This is a 100% project for the entire nation. Let's break down what we will achieve with a successful yes vote later on this year. We've got to remember this recognition piece, and Noel would have talked about the importance of the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This is the part, as I get around the country and I talk to many non-Indigenous people in particular about this, this is the part that really gets this is what gets people animated about the prospect. And you can see the light start to come on. Recognition is a very simple thing. Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this country. We're saying something about ourselves as a nation. We're saying that, and there's increasing levels of pride as I go around the country and I listen to people. This is the part that gets really, really encouraging. This is what actually makes us unique in the world. If we're to understand what makes being Australian unique in the world as it is right now, we're not the only democracy. We're not the only country that has been colonised by a European power. We're not the only country that has sent off its men and women to fight in foreign wars. We're not the only country with nice beaches and good wineries and ideas of mateship. There's plenty of other countries that have got that too. We are the only country in the world that is home to the oldest continuous culture on earth. We're the only country that's got connection to 65,000 years of unbroken story. And so when we get this recognition right, when we vote yes in the referendum later on this year, we are, as an Australian, able to connect our story not just to the last 235 years, which is important, which is part of who we are. Every Australian, whether you're a sixth generation Australian or you've achieved citizenship in the last 6 weeks and you know no other home, you can connect your story of what it means to be Australian to 65,000 years of history. The great irony of that is one of the most conservative proposals out there. You get to connect yourself to a deep, grounded story, the Indigenous story of this country. But we don't just do that through a fine bit of poetry plugged into the Constitution. We get to do it through a practical means. We get to provide an opportunity for people like Shane and the people that work alongside Shane and Tyrone and others to give them a voice. It's not like the status quo is kicking great goals on our affairs. And not that I want to stand here and talk about the other case, but that is effectively what they're arguing, that the status quo is good enough, that we can just keep doing what we're doing and think that that is good enough, not just for Indigenous peoples in this country, but for the kind of nation that we want to think of ourselves in the year 2023. Really? Is that good enough? I think the idea that Indigenous people have a life expectancy that's 8 years less than non-Indigenous peoples is something that a lot of people are frustrated with. They're frustrated that that is still the state of affairs in our country today. Optimistic that the solutions are out there. We need to understand that while the voice is not going to be a silver bullet, we're not going to wake up the day after the referendum or 6 months after or even a year or 2 years after and expect that it's all fixed. It's taken us generations to get to this point. It's going to take us years to come out the other side of this and finally get to that point where we are achieving genuine equality in our country. But this is the foundation. This is the missing piece. This is the piece that we haven't done, is by finally, formally doing this recognition piece and getting that voice there so that we can, over time, the real heavy lifting starts the day after the referendum. The real work starts there. That's what this is all about. We're only doing this because that work needs to be done. And we've got plenty of people. It won't be me. I'm heading off after the referendum. But it'll be people that will come to this and say, right, now's the time to really roll up our sleeves and start getting into these issues. Start really fulfilling the opportunity that is there when we get this right in our communities. That's what's on offer for all of us. So just briefly on the campaign and where we're up to, we've gone through a really, admittedly, a challenging time in the last couple of months, and it has been. It's been a necessary part of this process. We've needed to go through a pretty bruising parliamentary process to thrash out what the referendum question should be, to determine what the most appropriate constitutional provision should be, and yeah, it was a tough time. It was grounded in Canberra, owned by politicians and lawyers arguing over commas there and different words there and words that most Australians have never heard of and don't really care about in their day-to-day lives, but is important in terms of getting the provision right. The result is we've got a very, very strong provision. We've got a constitutionally safe provision. The overwhelming weight of the expert legal constitutional advice is that this is the safest and most appropriate way to change the Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the question is very simple too. It contains those two parts. And this, don't quote me on this verbatim, but it is effectively, do you agree to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this country, and should there be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? You're not going to be asked, do you like this model and that model and that model? You're not going to be asked, do you think it should be 25 or 35 or 45 people? You're not going to be asked where it should be based, what the colour of the carpet is. You're going to be asked, should there be one? Don't underestimate how important that is. Don't underestimate how important it is that millions of Australians come to the polling booth and say to this parliament, to this government, yes, there should be a voice. Yes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a say over their own communities. And then it is for the parliamentarians afterwards, as we've known all the way along, to do the work of finalising the detail. And I say finalising, we're not starting from a blank piece of paper. This isn't rocket science. We know what representative models look like. There's been a lot of work to get to this point. Those final questions around how people will be chosen, elected, how many, where they come from, that'll be nutted out following the referendum, as is the way that the Constitution works in this country. Our job is to get out there and engage as many people as we possibly can. Know that there are millions of Australians that are getting out there and supporting this. We've got an army of volunteers, more than 15,000 that are signed up across the country. They're already door knocking, phone banking, holding the community stalls at the local markets on a Saturday morning. There's nearly 200 community groups that are signed up for Yes to support. We've got people ready to run the polling day booths in more than, I think, about 110 now we're up to out of the 151 electorates. So we'll get there absolutely by the time the referendum comes around in October. That groundwork is starting to make a difference. And I'll just finish on this point. Of course, we see the polls. We're not naive. We're not complacent. We're not totally dismissive. But we are putting them into context. That is part of a conversation that's been going on at one level of this whole debate. And we know we've got work to do. Understand that. And it is also a fundamentally different conversation when you get out there in the communities. I was door knocking in Perth last week, talking to FIFO miners and tradies and people of all different ages. There is, and it's stark, and you don't read about it in the news, that's why it's so stark. There is this underlying goodwill and generosity and curiosity that is sitting there in the Australian population. When you ask one question, well, how would you vote now, 100 days out from the vote, when people haven't been totally engaged, when people are dealing with cost of living pressures at the forefront of their mind at the moment? Yeah, there are responses in a way that suggest that a lot of people we've got a way to go. When you sit down and have a yarn with somebody and say, well, this is what it's about, have you heard about it? It's fundamentally different. The openness, the willingness to listen, the willingness to engage, the willingness to have people's minds changed on this is absolutely there. That is why we're putting an incredible focus on making sure that we're getting the people on the ground so that we can foster these conversations across the community. So you're going to see more and more of the Yes campaign active in communities across the country, and you're going to start to hear and see more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through our various different channels talking about why this is important to them and why they want you to get out and support us in a successful Yes vote later on this year. I might just pause there because I'm really keen to hear some questions, and feel free to ask the question that you really want to ask, not the one you think is the one for polite company. I've heard them all before anyway, so I'd be very surprised if there's anything that shocks or awes. But yeah, I'm really keen to hopefully answer as well as best I can.
Thank you very much. It's very compelling. I just find it hard when I'm asked about my opinion to not be like emotional and look at people and like, it just makes sense. So what's the not no arguments that, like, what are some of the arguments of the no campaign, and what are your counter arguments to help people who want to like unofficially campaign for the yes, but don't necessarily have the right words for people to say, oh, but my friend was told they couldn't put a fence in their field because it was a sacred site or things like that. I'm just,
Yeah. Well, the yes and the no cases have been printed. They were printed or released on the Australian Electoral Commission's website yesterday. Sorry, the days are a bit of a blur at the moment. So the official no case is there. And obviously the official yes case is there as well. So I'd encourage you to read that. I'd just say a couple of things about the support. You don't have to be an expert, and in fact, the most compelling argument that you can make is the one that comes from your own experience of why you support this. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I'm not gonna argue the constitutional toss with people. I'm gonna kind of do in a bush lawyer kind of way sometimes when I have to, but that's not the most, because that's not my comfort zone. I would interrogate your own reasons why this is important to you as an Australian, as a voter, as somebody that wants to support this, and share that. Because just this simple act of you declaring your support and being, I guess, staunch in that support when you're you're that person at the family barbecue or the gathering or the event and talking about why this is important to you is incredibly compelling for other people. It's almost like a safety in numbers thing. Just the idea that you might be wearing the shirt or the badge or talking about why this is important to you actually makes other people feel that might be a little bit nervous about that might be a little bit kind of cautious about exploring this themselves. It makes them feel a lot more comfortable, like there's an invitation for them to open up into a really positive way of talking about it. So don't underestimate how important your own just inherent support actually is. It's hard to break down all of the arguments, and some of the arguments are coming at from different spectrums. One of the arguments is that we shouldn't be treating people differently on the basis of race. I'll just say a couple of things about that. I'm sure Noel covered it off in a far better way last night. This is not about race. Race is being a social kind of construct. Indigeneity is a fact of our history. There's no argument. There's no argument of 65,000 years of history that there were people indigenous to this country before Cook arrived and before the other European explorers arrived. And acknowledging that and saying that that is a part of our shared heritage just feels like in 2023 something that we can do. So it's not about race. However, the Constitution does mention race. There are still legacy references to race, which means that certain laws can be made on the basis of that. And the only time they've ever been used is to make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So if you've got provision within the Constitution to make laws exceptionally for a particular group of people, then surely it follows that those people should have a say in the way that those laws are constructed. Advice on how those laws should be constructed. But yeah, I would lead for the vast majority of people, they will be compelled simply by the fact that you are declaring your own support and saying why this is important to you. I encourage you to read up on the yes and the no cases to equip yourself with that, but don't overcomplicate it. Keep it really simple, and people will be compelled by just the fact that you're standing up there and going, yep, I'm going to vote yes. This is the very simple reason why.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Always a great speaker. I was fortunate enough to listen to Dean up in 2018 at Home Valley Station with at the AGM forums. Remember that? Anyway, so my question is, when I've been having conversations around the kitchen table, and you've got these staunch individuals who are just like, mate, why would I vote yes to something I don't know the details about? Like, if I'm going to say this, why don't I have the answers to this, and this, and this? And I'm finding that argument being my most challenging kind of conversation, because they're saying, what about this, this? And I was speaking to Nolan Hunter last week, and he goes, well, the reality is when we do referendums, you sort out the details later. But I wonder, why is it that now people have these expectations, or where is it on a comms level how you guys are addressing that you don't have the details set out until you have a successful referendum?
Yeah, so it is an interesting one, because if you actually answered those questions with a 100-page detailed design report, most people wouldn't know what they're looking at. And that's not to diminish anybody's intellect on this sort of thing, but for most Australians, the questions of Indigenous representative bodies, of governance, of the relationship of the Parliament and the executive government and electoral models and all of that it's just not part of our day-to-day interest. What we've found in this question is the question of, I don't know the detail. Actually, it isn't the underlying intention behind that. The underlying intention is, I want to know that this is going to make a difference. Whether it's 24 or 36 or 48, whatever role the Australian Electoral Commission may or may not have in the selection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples isn't really the point. The point is, I'm frustrated with the lack of progress. I think we should be further along in 2023 than what we are on some of these issues. I want to know, firstly, that it's constitutionally safe, and you can very simply answer that question by saying, well, the vast majority, the overwhelming weight of legal opinion says that it is. And I want to know that it's safe, and I want to know that it'll have a practical change on the ground. And I keep coming back to these examples that we see time and time again, the work that people like Shane and others have done in terms of youth justice and engaging the youth in their communities. I look at the things that they're doing in the Kimberley with land management. I look at, we were out in one of the communities in the Kimberleys a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about some of the challenges for the youth in the community, getting into trouble out in the streets and blah, blah, blah. And what they were talking about, if you just took a normal sort of government lens to this sort of thing, you'd say, oh, well, that's a youth, disturbance, a youth law and order issue. And that'd be the approach. And then there's all these round tables and intergovernmental agencies that have come together and talk about, well, how do we solve the youth problem in this community? And they were saying it's about the housing. It's about the lack of housing and the insufficient housing and the fact that there wasn't enough accommodation for people to be in, so the young people were ending up out in the streets and getting into trouble. That is it, and it sounds obvious. It sounds just like the most obvious thing to do, but that is the thing that's been missing from a lot of these conversations around how do we actually get to the not just the symptoms but the actual challenges themselves. So I think part of the opportunity is to say, well, look, we know that across the breadth of and to solve a housing issue in Redfern as opposed to one in the Kimberley or the Pilbara or Cape York is very, very different. Different drivers, different underlying things. Of course, we should be asking those people out there what's going to work for them. Of course, we know that bureaucrats in Canberra and Sydney aren't going to know, despite the best of intentions and the best will of the world, can't know how it works in Fitzroy Crossing or Arakoon. So that is why this idea of saying, you know what, I know we want to make sure that our vote leads to something practical. What's doing is not working. Why don't we just give the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a say over these issues, and that will be the start for us to get to some of these challenges. But that's the kind of underlying piece here is people want to know that their vote's going to lead to something good on the ground.
Thanks, Dean. Following on from Noel's speech last night and your presentation today, it is very simple, but I don't know, the politicians can make things complicated. And I don't think, I think Noel summed it up very simply last night when he talked about, well, there's the detail in point 2. That's the detail you need to know. My question is sort of along sort of similar theme, but how do you get the media to engage in getting the story out that it is simple, like should Aboriginal people have a voice? Because that is not what you're hearing in the media currently.
You almost have to change your business model. I think I think in some ways the media have taken a certain approach to the way that they're reporting on this, and unfortunately it hasn't quite landed that this referendum and this campaign is fundamentally different to your run-of-the-mill election campaign where you've got effectively two parties that are known quantities, duking it out, and then, reporting on a kind of two-horse race and then see who wins. And and they've taken that approach to this, which is a fundamentally different proposition, the whole approach. So I don't necessarily think that actually trying to convince the media is our best shot. I think the best shot is continuing as much as we possibly can to engage as many people as much as we possibly can, so that when those messages do arrive, when people really do start to put their minds to this closer to the actual vote, which is what will happen, that there has been enough conversation, there has been enough information, there has been enough engagement that people go, well, hang on, I've heard about this, and I've heard about how simple and unifying and how practical this actually is, and I'm reading this or hearing this, that doesn't make sense. I'm actually trusting that the information that I've been provided is the right way to go. And again, I just come back to, I think that is the real opportunity here in this campaign. That is why, quite seriously, every conversation counts. There's not going to be a one-trick ad campaign that's going to win this vote. There's not even going to be 3 or 4 of them. That'll be important. It'll be important for the breadth of the message that we can get out there. But it will ultimately come down to millions of conversations around the country, and that is why I'd say to anybody, and we've done the numbers on this, we've got some pretty sharp people in the campaign. If of all the millions of people that are wanting to vote yes now, if 10% of them talk to 2 people that haven't heard about this or are undecided, and win 2 people across, just 10% of our supporters bring 2 people from undecided to yes, we win the referendum. So yeah, of course, it's this great big campaign and there's all these mechanisms and we'll be doing everything we possibly can. But there is an opportunity for every single person who supports this to have a profound impact on their families, their communities, their workplaces. That will put us in a very, very good position come voting time. That's why I say let's not overcomplicate this. Let's control the things that we can. We can't control the media. Like to, but I can't. So let's control the things that we can do, which is our advocacy and our commitment to make sure that we're getting as much of that personal message as we possibly can about why this is important.
In terms of some of the things you're seeing on sort of levels of confusion in the community, and is there kind of one issue or 2 issue that people sort of are confused about that on the referendum, and then I guess how do you respond to some of that confusion when they ask those types of questions?
I mean, I'll say a couple of things. It's much easier to muddy the water and confuse an issue than it is to be on our side and proactively argue for a positive case. So understand that is a much easier a thing to do. We're aware of it. We know what we need to do around it. It's somewhat contextual, depending on the place. Which is really important, obviously, in a referendum where you have to achieve the double majority. Western Australia, for example, at the moment, the conflation of the heritage laws with the voice, again, is just one of those things that it's not really a connected issue. In fact, it's not a connected issue at all. State-based heritage laws versus a constitutionally enshrined voice at the national level. But again, for those that want to try and sow some doubt and confusion around that, it can. So firstly, it's an easier thing to do. Secondly, it is contextual to the location. again, without trying to sound like I'm oversimplifying it, the more that we can talk and the more that we can share with our networks, with our organisations, with our communities, with the people that we work with the customers that we serve, the more that we can be relentless in getting that message out there. And I have to say, on those issues of confusion, misinformation, it's a mistake for us to try and go directly at it in a way that looks like it's divisive. And in fact, it's a tactic to try and draw us into a very divisive argument on this. Firstly, that is not where this idea came from. This idea came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people seeking and aiming for unity. That is how we have approached this right from the beginning. That's the founding point. And also, anything that looks and sounds like division, anything that looks and sounds like two sides going at each other, doesn't help us, it helps them. Takes us to a place we don't want to go. So, again, on those points, it is about making sure that people have access to the information. As I say, the yes pamphlets are out, the arguments are there, the information's there. There's little examples in different parts around the country about how a voice and how that version of a voice has worked. I would just continue to keep pushing those messages out there, and it's just about being consistent, being very generous with some of those arguments, and pushing out again why this is important to you. I know I keep coming back to that point, but a lot of these things that we're dealing with are actually designed to take us away from that, because that's how we win. It's Australians of goodwill, sitting down with each other, talking to each other, engaging with each other, being respectful with each other, and saying, 2023 modern Australian nation. Of course we can recognise Indigenous peoples as the first peoples, and of course we can ensure that there's a voice. I don't know if that's answered your question at all. No, don't let him ask a question.
So, Chris, from the Territory, one of the things that I have, a lot of friends, share, they've seen this and so on Facebook, on Instagram, really negative, divisive stories, and, example, most of them completely fabricated. One of the things that we have to deal with, and we're dealing with this on a personal basis as well, is that this world has changed. Social media is, most people don't get their news from the media outlets. It's from Facebook or Instagram, and that's they never turn on the ABC News and get a bit of balance going there. So it's one of those things. How do we encourage our friends and networks to actually? Because that's one thing. Having a conversation. We have that conversation once and then we walk away, and then we trust our friend that we have the positive conversation with, that they are believing what we tell them. But then that very next minute, they get one Facebook post and another one and another one and another one. And true, the algorithms are all screwed up, but there's actually massive reinforcement of, really divisive, completely fabricated. And, if you go to Media Watch, you can actually see some of these, images that get shared. They're actually been made up. They're not true. There's no truth. How do we kind of get our friends and networks to trust that genuine conversation that we're having against the onslaught of all this negative, rubbish, made up jargon that's going on Facebook and Twitter and that?
Tell them to turn off Twitter. I have. I'll leave that with my media team now. I think you're right, Chris. It's a really important point. particularly for people that are genuinely, and I know you are, super supportive and want to see success here. We do need to do work on our family and friends, and we do need to have and reinforce those conversations. I know it sounds really weird. It took me a little while to get used to it, but now just saying the same thing over and over again, you actually got to do it. You got to keep reinforcing those same messages, have those same conversations. I think point out to certain people, there are places like RMIT that are doing fact checking on some of the more egregious claims that are going out there. So definitely point people to that. Places like yes23.com.au. My sense is, and I know how intoxicating it can be to read negativity. Like, it's just this weird thing that goes on in our heads, right? That just sort of draws us into. I get bombarded on a daily basis from people sending me the latest negative memes that they've seen, and I just got to sort of keep it out because there's a fascination with it. One of the things that the other side can't do is they can't inject any joy or happiness into their arguments. They can't actually talk about vision. They can't actually talk about hope and the country that we actually want to be. They can try and divide. They certainly can't talk about solutions. So I would, as you say, continue to reinforce those conversations as much as you possibly can. I'd also try and, we had some rallies around the country a couple of weekends ago. About 20,000 people turned out, community events. And it was so stark. You saw kids getting their face painted, families gathering, people enjoying themselves. This doesn't have to be constitutional, change in parliaments and governments and governance and all of that sort of stuff. It can be something that we can all talk to our families and be like, you know what? There's an opportunity for us to come together at the end of the year and vote yes in favour of something that's really positive and supportive and will help us be a better country. I think we've got to make sure that we remind ourselves and remind our family and friends that this is something that everybody can be part of and we can actually feel good about it. And it doesn't cost us anything. It doesn't cost anyone anything to just go, you know what, I'm going to get behind this and I'm going to support it and I'm going to vote yes. So keep reinforcing those conversations. Keep it upbeat. Because while those negativity and those messages can be intoxicating, I think in our heart of hearts, we want to be part of something that actually is good. We want to be part of something that's unifying, that leads to real change, and just be utterly relentless about that.
Hi, just have a question. Is that all right?
You're about to bring the hook out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for the presentation. It's been great, and I love the idea that small conversations can make big change, sort of thing. And I know you just said not to focus on negativity, but what happens if the yes vote doesn't get up? What's next for the campaign and for the Uluru Statement and that sort of thing? I mean, we hope it doesn't happen, but what would next steps be?
It's very difficult for me to answer that question in a way that does justice to it, because doing what we're doing in this campaign to put the yes case forward just takes everything. There's no kind of provision for a what if scenario, and that's not. I don't think that's being. I don't think that's lacking caution or being reckless. It focuses our energy 100% on the job that is needed to bring people across to the yes side. We know that this is a big thing. We know that there's a lot at stake. We all feel very acutely the responsibility. individually and collectively. And we're doing it because we believe it's the right thing to do, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have said that this is the right thing to do. So without giving you a very political answer, which I kind of have, the reality is we just have to use every bit of our energy not to speculate about what if, but to do whatever we can to influence what is actually possible here. That's the best I can do with that.
So I guess as we are winding, I want to thank, obviously I want you to thank Dean for us. That's one thing, so thank you, Dean. It's been amazing. And we'll get Ross up in a sec, but this is a goodwill journey from our side as a community. We know what has to be done, because everything that's happening right now isn't taking us out of that industry, and that industry it's the trauma industry, and it's keeping us in there. If it's a simple thing, it's about facts. We need facts. We need people to go out there. The facts are out there. The campaign has them. Let's get those. Let's share it. But we're all part of this journey together. This is an opportunity for Australians to do something that brings us together, that empowers us as a whole country. We have this opportunity. This is 2023. I think this is our moment to do this, and it's all idealistic. But if I can give you something that we leave with, just to think about, if we look at the campaign, yes, there. If we look at the current situation, if you looked at the top of that country and put a line across the top half of that country, the top half of that country pays 5 times more to eat food that we do in the cities. You look at that little dot down the bottom there, they pay the same as what we get. There's something wrong with that, and it has to be fixed. There's families and communities all around this country who are building through hope, empowerment, and they are measuring what they do, and they are out there in all parts of this country, and we need to see them. And the only way we're going to see them is to give them a voice, and that voice is going to happen unfortunately, from lots of the big centres, because they are in remote places that people need to help that change and give them the opportunity to empower themselves. So you guys, we really do, we thank you. We're grateful that we've got the opportunity to share this moment in history, but we do need you to be the champions of it. And we need you to walk with us. That's all we're really asking. So thank you, Dean. Ross, would you like to come up, please?
Thank you so much, Shane and Dean. I guess I think we've been so fortunate over the last couple of days to hear 3 excellent speakers, 2 of which I might point out are Queenslanders. Very, very hard act to beat. Noel Pearson.
You can still change, brother.
Yeah, I mean, what great speakers both Noel and Dean are in their different but equally effective ways. The other thing I did want to do is to thank the Clean Energy Council. As some of you know, this is an event which Dean and I and separately Noel had been planning for some time, and it happened to coincide with this particular conference, so we were able to bring both events together. Going forward, one thing we do want to do is to, I guess, continue the discussion going forward to try to, I suppose, enable people to actually appreciate what is being asked of them in the referendum, which, to be honest, in my mind, is both modest and generous. Modest in the sense that surely it's incontestable that Indigenous people have lived on this continent for many millennia. It seems uncontroversial that we should recognise that. Second, generous in the sense that Aboriginal people are offering us, I think, the opportunity to start to repair, the 235 years of history, which has not been great for the Australian character and identity. And in that sense, I guess it really is an opportunity for us all to start to change the course of that history and to offer future generations of Australians something different. So going forward, we hope to be able to create some additional events like this. We want to offer them by way of live stream so that our colleagues in other companies can also start to appreciate it. The only other point I think that I'd like to make is, apart from recognising, of course, past history, is the creation of a voice. Again, it does seem to me a very uncontroversial idea that we should invite Aboriginal people to speak their mind to the country's national government. Doesn't mean that those views have to be adopted, just means that they have the ability to participate in the national political conversation. Again, in my mind, a very modest request. So thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming, and a huge thanks in particular to Shane and Dean, and of course in absentia Noel Pearson for his remarkable oration last night. Thank you.